everyone. I am Melissa Cahoy, the editor of Portal Libraries in the Academy and an education librarian at University Park.
Hi, I'm Wendy Pothier, Associate Editor of Portal Libraries in the Academy and Associate Professor and Business and Economics Librarian at the University of New Hampshire.
And we are joined today by our 2026 Best Article Award winners. Woohoo! I need my applauding hands right now. Portal's Best Article Award for 2026 was given to the authors of the July 2025 Portal article, A Comprehensive Study of Library-Led Textbook Affordability Initiatives in the United States. Could you introduce yourselves, please, authors?
Sure, I'll go first. My name is Rachel Scott, and I'm the head of acquisitions and cataloging services and a professor at the University Library, University of Illinois.
And I'm Mitchell Scott, no relation, right, Rachel? And I'm the coordinator of collection strategies at the University of Kentucky.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Mitchell and Rachel. And on behalf of everyone at Portal, congratulations on your award. We are thrilled for you, and we really appreciate you joining us today to explore some questions about your article and your Best Article Award win. So I'm going to start us off with the first question, which is, what sparked your interest in this research topic? And why do you think it feels especially important or timely right now?
So I'm going to be a little long-winded on this one, so bear with me. So Rachel and I both had experience managing and presenting on and producing research around library-led textbook affordability initiatives. We had articles run in the same issue of the Journal of Collection Management, which is where I first saw Rachel's work on this topic. And when I was doing lit reviews for previous work, I found little to no mention of how exactly libraries were managing this work, like who was responsible for it, how it fit into overall collection and library strategy. So we got together and decided just to investigate all of it. And I think one cool anecdote of this is that Rachel and I didn't know each other prior to this collaboration. So it was a cold call email that got us together that basically said hey, you've done stuff on this, I've done stuff on this. Let's see what we can do together. I think it's especially important now because libraries, like all campus units and departments, are asked more than ever before to demonstrate impact, especially on student success. And to me, these library-led textbook affordability initiatives provide some of the most direct ties to student success, and then definitely some of the most visible. I mean, it's the library coordinating an effort to play a role in addressing the affordability of higher ed, like equitable access to materials that are required to be successful in the course, and then, potentially playing a role in helping to address student retention, DFW rates, persistence, and academic success. So all of those things administrators think about and want other departments to be focused on. And I know everybody's budget's different, and all of this can be done with a relatively small portion of your overall collection budget. I think it's also interesting to have this mapped out in this comprehensive way, especially now as higher ed is facing potential constricting budgets and what that means for library collection budgets. I know from the work I've done on this and looking ahead, I think some libraries may have to make some tough calls soon between maintaining robust initiatives like this or supporting transformative agreements or electronic journals or more traditional library resources and services. And I think it'll be interesting to see how these initiatives survive institutions having to deal with budget reductions in that way. And I think it'll also be interesting to see how these initiatives survive institutions moving to first aid programs or inclusive access programs, and what that means to library-led affordability initiatives like what we documented.
Thanks so much, Mitchell. Yeah, it seems like it really is a turning point time for all of this.
Yeah.
Rachel, I just wanted to see if you wanted to add anything to that before we move on to the next question, but please feel welcome to.
Mitchell covered it, and we're going to take turns a little bit. We decided to be strategically lazy.
Perfect. Elisa and I will also take turns
Totally
asking
strategic,
questions.
not
Yeah,
lazy.
that's very thoughtful. I have a kind of, follow-up. That was a great introduction to the topic. And for readers or our viewers of this video, readers who haven't yet explored your article, how would you briefly describe its key focus and key findings?
Yeah, so in a nutshell, we conducted a survey and follow-up interviews with academic librarians engaged in library-led textbook affordability initiatives. We investigated every single aspect of these initiatives we could think of. And as Mitchell said, both of us have been involved in these. So we knew a lot of the particulars. And so we did a deep dive into every single aspect of it, from how librarians source the data surrounding textbook adoption, their considerations and licensing content, their staffing, their workflows, their budgeting, to the alignment of these initiatives with open educational resource work and broader campus initiatives and strategy. Our goal was to understand and contextualize the challenges that U.S. librarians face in establishing and maintaining these programs. And as far as our findings, we found that these programs have grown both in number and scale in the past few years, which actually we found acceleration during the COVID-19 pandemic lockdowns. And we found that they've been sustained even without permanent or designated funding due to the consistently positive perceptions about their impact on student success, on just-in-time delivery, and overall alignment with library and campus goals.
All right. Thanks so much, Rachel. We're going to move on to our next question, which really talks about the award that your article received itself. So, as we mentioned, your article was selected by the Portal Libraries in the Academy editorial board as the winner of the 2026 Portal Best Article Award. And what elements of your article do you think connected most with readers and with the Portal board?
So some of the feedback we got from the portal board was how thorough this article is, which is, compliment. It is a whopping 38 pages. So we do really, I mean, Rachel mentioned this, we do really cover this process from start to finish, leaving like no stone unturned along the way. When we held our interviews with our practitioners, our biggest conversation point was always explain your process. I mean, that's where we did like the deepest of dives. And we'd spend like half the interview talking about that. And it's really interesting that, the processes are so varied yet so similar, and also entirely dependent on like institutional partners, staffing, funding, and how library and institutions like prioritize this work. I think another thing that resonates is the positioning of these initiatives as institutionally valuable. One library called theirs the crown jewel in their library's portfolio when speaking with administrators. And I think this sentiment is super common for all the people that manage these programs and do this work. And, we spend a lot of time, well, we spend some time in the article engaging with like both the aspirational and actual assessment of these initiatives, and both the aspirational and, actual sort of perception toward these initiatives, both by the librarians that support them and then within their libraries and their institutions.
Thanks, Mitchell.
Thank, yeah, thank you. And as you mentioned, it is a very thorough article that covers all aspects. What would you say is the central takeaway or big idea that you hope readers would carry with them after reading the article?
Yeah, I'll return to the finding that librarians are finding a way to continue these programs even without permanent funding, which is exceptional, I think. By sheer force of will and determination, they're making it happen. For many of the folks we interviewed, this is the most meaningful work that they're doing. And to take it even a step further, sometimes librarians doing more back of house or technical services work can feel cut off from library initiatives, and especially from student success work. But this work is a very material support for student success that they directly contribute to. And if I can have two takeaways, my second and final takeaway is how scalable these programs are, right? So the range of expenditures and staffing was huge. And it just really shows me that um, you can give as much or as little as is available. And we found it telling to hear participants explain that in the semesters that they didn't have funding, they couldn't come up with any additional funding, they still did the work. For example, by notifying faculty about previously licensed content from the library. And so they were making it happen with almost no additional resources because it was so meaningful to them personally and so impactful for the library. Those are my two
Well,
takeaways.
I love those two takeaways. Thank you, Rachel. We'll permit two for sure. And I just wanted to follow up and say, like, what a beautiful testimony of the tenacity of librarians and their dedication to our users and especially students in this scenario. So thank you for articulating that.
I we don't have to include this one in the video unless you want to, but I'm just curious, with some institutions not having permanent funding, how do you do long-term planning in this realm in such an uncertain environment?
Well, I think that what they're making available is often from their large ebook packages. So that's what they're sort of falling back on. I think permanent fund, like even the loss of funding, a lot of libraries are maintaining those large ebook packages that you can sort of, dig into to make available. And it's certainly a small number when you're doing that, and you don't have the ability to go out and buy title by title for things that you see. And so I think that's where you see sort of the reduction of the number of things you can provide, but also you still have the ability to provide something, so.
Absolutely. So those numbers on the budget side and on the staffing side, and on the availability of data for course assignment, those all fluctuate pretty wildly. We saw across the board. I think there are very few programs that have consistent, dedicated funding that they can plan for. And that to me shows the resilience of the librarians doing the work and also of these programs, and that despite the fluctuations, they find a way. And some semesters there's inherently less. If there is more, maybe they'll do a summer program where previously they couldn't because there was no additional or surplus funding. So it's very fascinating to see how at the individual level, but also broader scale, these programs have seen growth. And I think it has a lot to do not with the security of funding and planning, but with resilience and intention and commitment.
Is really inspiring. Thanks so much for reflecting on that.
Mm.
Okay, so how do you see this, kind of building on that? How do you see this article and your work in this area influencing library practice, research, and future conversations in the field?
So I think we hope that libraries that come across this are inspired about Rachel's talked about this, the various ways to approach these initiatives at your institution or within your specific context. Like we're all beautiful snowflakes, right? We know it varies across libraries and higher ed. And so, but there's a way to apply this potentially to whatever your specific context is. Not all of us have bookstore partnerships, but as we document, libraries are finding a variety of ways to gain access to required material data. So I think our hope is that libraries find this incredibly practical and can use this to develop new initiatives, maybe adapt existing initiatives, which I learned things during this research that I've applied to the initiative that I manage. And so it's been helpful for me in that way. And then maybe hold up as examples when having conversations with, library administrators or campus administrators about the impact and potential success of these initiatives. When I was thinking about like future conversations, one thing we talk about this a bit in the article, but most of us use like the OER model when discussing cost savings for these initiatives, and that model assumes that all enrolled students use the free library supplied textbook and as a result do not purchase a copy. I think if you talk to most practitioners of these programs, most would admit that that's not the actual practice. And we've gotten feedback from instructors and students that while, this could be the case for some students that they're choosing the library supplied ebook over purchasing a copy, others appreciate, and I think this is like the secondary value of this is like others appreciate the ability to have access to these required materials in multiple formats. And so they may buy the print copy, but then rely on the ebook for quick access, for access while at work, for access at clinicals, or a variety of other ways that we are yet to think about. So I'd love to see like future research that like attempts to identify like the number of enrolled students that actually use these in their courses and then maybe why. So I think that's, if these initiatives are here to stay, I think it'd be interesting to really dig into what that looks like.
Great, thank you. And since you mentioned potential future research threads, and as you said, you connected with each other through your shared similar research interests, how do you see, how does this article connect with the work that you're planning on going into the future in this topic or maybe similar topics?
Yeah, I mean, so Mitchell kind of explained the cold call situation. We connected because of our research on this topic. We're both very interested, both at a practical and theoretical level about this research. And so the number of kind of research questions and directions are infinite. And we're starting a new research project on a related topic, and excited to dig into that work and engage our community of library and practitioners again. Um, and I think, we're also both interested in challenges surrounding library support for open access publishing. Mitchell alluded to that earlier, and from a budgetary perspective, textbook affordability and open access publishing initiatives kind of compete. Budget is finite, and so understanding how and why libraries support one over the other is interesting, I think. And for me, these topics are connected. Libraries support the teaching, learning, and research missions of their university, in part via our collections and the agreements with publishers. And Mitchell and I are both involved in that work on a kind of a regular, ongoing basis during our day jobs. So I think kind of questions about that necessarily creep into our research and trying to find the right balance. And often it's community specific. Often there are aspects of our institutions and of our researchers and contexts that are limitations or opportunities. So understanding and investigating how best to strategically fund such initiatives is an art and a science. And I think we're both absolutely invested in continuing this research and ensuring not only that our communities are well served, but also that practitioners at institutions that don't have a research agenda or support for conducting research get some best practices, get data from across the U.S. on what the possibilities are, what the best practices are, and how they can support the important teaching and learning missions of their own institutions.
Thanks so much, Rachel. So it has been fascinating to really, dig into sort of the backstory of your collaboration and your focus on this research with both of you today. We really appreciate your time. Is there anything else that you would like to share with our portal readers?
I'll just note that this research project is incredibly meaningful. As we've said a few times, we've both been doing this work, and a lot of the studies surrounding textbook affordability initiatives have been local. So they've been case studies from one institution. So working with someone who's also invested in this work to see the bigger picture has been really useful to me. I think Mitchell's approach has tended to be more quantitative, and mine has been tended to be more qualitative. So the fact that we could draw on both of our strengths to see the bigger picture has been hugely fun and rewarding. And so to have it recognized by Portal is exceptionally meaningful. So thanks to you all for this award, and it's especially meaningful to have it acknowledge a project that's been really cool and helpful to the community.
Well
Thank you, and
said.
congratulations to you both. Mitchell, did you have any final thoughts you wanted to share? All right.
No, I think Rachel
Well,
said it all. Yeah, thank you.
we really appreciated your time and sharing these insights with our readers. And for our readers, you can find Mitchell and Rachel's article online via Portal's website on Project Muse in our July 2025 issue, Volume 25, Issue 3. Thank you for joining us today, Rachel and Mitchell, and congratulations again on your very well-deserved Best Article Award. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.